inviting me. I was actually delighted to screen this one when it came about because I had already seen it. I had actually gone to the premiere or one of the premiere in Paris, um, and was invited, sort of off the cuff by a survivor that I was interviewing. So when I went to it, it was in a very particular context with the actors and one of the producers on site. And it was also with a very particular kind of audience, an audience of the French Jewish community, pretty much of the 16th arrondissement. So I'll be very curious to hear what you have to say about what is no doubt a very quirky film. It is not your average romantic comedy date night film. It is certainly not your average post Holocaust film or even Quest for Origins film. Um, and yet, I have to say that I found the film fascinating. And each time I watch it, I find it more fascinating um, from my perspective, which for those of you who know me, you know that I primarily work on French Jews. Um, and although the film is called in English Honeymoon in Poland, it actually is called only Honeymoon, Lune de Miel, in French, because it's about the two of them going off on this journey after their, first child. And before that, it was Même pas froid, its working title, which means not even cold. And that's, of course, an allusion to what you hear in the film when she says, she arrives, her mother saying it's going to be freezing in Poland, and we'll get back to what her mother has to say about Poland, which is pretty audacious in the context when this film was made. But she's not cold because she's so entranced and has so idealized her Polish origins. But so the film is not your typical rom-com. It's certainly not a typical post-Holocaust film, and yet it is a quest for origins, a quest for roots. We've seen these before, either in documentary like The Flat, The Lift, um, the yeah, I think it was called The Flat in English, and or some of the films we've seen here, Midnight Orchestra, where you also have a quest for origins. I wanted to point out why I found the film fascinating as a specialist of French Jews, and I'll start with the biggest twist for me. Um, at a time when French Jews have become more and more religious, at a time when our stereotype about the French Jewish community, which used to be that they're assimilated, they're not Jewish enough. I'm speaking in grand generalizations here and reductions. Um, and the stereotypes no longer apply of the Ashkenaz assimilated Jew who has no relationship to Judaism. The majority of French Jews at this time, and we have about 500,000, probably less now because of mass aliyut over the 21st century. Um, 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 the the majority is Sephardim. The majority respect kashrut. The majority are schooling their children in religious schools rather than in French public schools. So to see this come out and go to the premiere in 2019, it was pretty shocking. It was pretty surprising to me to see an homage to assimilation, which is where we end. My mother did not want to be Polish. She did not want to be Jewish. She wanted to be French and Parisian. So although the film very interestingly takes on the decor of Poland, and I'll get back to that, and seems to evacuate France, it really is in dialogue with post Holocaust memory in France, and in particular with uh, the myth of silence that has been talked about. I'll come back to that. The fact that certain generations, the second generation was said not to speak, and this is a third generation film. So I want to come back now to, I'll tell you a little bit more about why I find it fascinating, to the filmmaker. Elise Ottenberger is a French Jew of Polish extraction. This is her first film. So as I said, the audience that I saw it with, they weren't enthralled with the film. They were jarred to some degree by the quirky bawdiness of it. I'm really sorry, my dog is snoring in the background. I'll try and get rid of that in a second. With the bawdiness of it. But it's a film that's largely autobiographical. inspired by autobiographical moment when her husband's family was in fact, her husband was in fact invited to a commemoration in Scherz. So in that sense, it takes its inspiration from a real trip that she took in 2009 and the memory work that the two of them had been doing on the internet, which brought them to that memorial site. So it's a pretty audacious film for a first film. And although it seems light, it is packed with dialogues with various issues. So Holocaust memory, transmission, these things that I hope you're going to ask about, the family. The depiction of the family is very interesting. It's a family of French Jews that are a particular ilk. So I mentioned that the majority now in France of French Jews are Sephardim, who are religious, or what we would call traditionalist in France, which is more than American conservative. It's in between modern Orthodox and what we call conservative. This family is not your typical Ashkenazim that we talk about in France from Alsace-Lorraine. They are of Polish extraction, so they have in the film, come fairly recently, and they don't fit in to that group. They're within the Ashkenazim, but within the Ashkenazim, don't forget that prior to the war, French Jews were not always, were very, were concerned about mass immigration of Jews from Eastern Europe. So to give you a little background going into that war, there were about 300,000 Jews, 300 to 300,000 Jews on the eve of World War II. Of those, 3/4 were from Eastern Europe. And of those, half of them had only come in the decade before the war and were not French citizens. So this was the sort of divisions within the group are important. And I want you to keep that in mind when you look at this family that, as Mo mentioned to me this morning, are you going to tell them that French families scream at each other as a form of affection? And that's true, but it's also a class distinction. So this family that you're looking at they're a French couple. One of the things she insists on is that, they're French Jews, but if you look at the one scene when they get to Poland, when she says, my family was Polish, she says, your grandfather was more Jewish than Polish. So that whether you're French Jewish or Jewish French, Polish Jewish or Jewish Polish is going to come out. So my biggest surprise was that in 2019, this film would make an homage to assimilation to France, completely evacuating decades of self-recriminating Jews who questioned themselves for participating in what was a final solution, doing the Nazis' work. Or Jews being anti-Semitic. And we see that. There are some wonderful moments in the film that I'll come back to, but one of them is that great moment where he says, I can't believe I married a Jewish woman. It would have been so much easier to marry it. He doesn't say shiksa, I don't remember what he says. But he says, and then she says, great, I married a Jewish anti-Semite. My husband's an anti-Semite. So these tensions within the Jewish community and what one does. So the film takes place primarily in Poland, and it gives it that Holocaust tourism aspect, Holocaust memory aspect. But in fact, the French side of it is extremely important. One of the fascinating things, I think, about the evacuation of France, it doesn't tell the history at all of France during the war. And it actually, you assume that the grandmother is in Poland at the time. Now that's where it diverges from autobiography, because her grandmother, the filmmaker's grandmother, was actually in France in the decade before the war. So in fact, that's completely fictionalized. And this idea of fiction and history is important to the film. It's a very, very delicate or indelicate balance, depending on how you see the film, and it's widely panned in some circles. It is fictionalized, it's fiction, and yet there are moments when documentary permeates it or punctuates it. And one of these moments is an important moment. It is in the cemetery when they're first in Krakow, and they meet one of the guides who is talking to school children. And they go up to her, and she is actually a survivor. So the filmmaker didn't feel that it was appropriate to fictionalize a survivor. She actually used a woman called Eveline Ashkolvitz, who is well known for doing all of these visits in France that have become common currency beginning in about 95, when Chirac first acknowledged French responsibility in the Holocaust. We saw in the 21st century a range of different kinds of commemoration plaques going up that commemorate. But that commemoration doesn't take place in France. France's Jewish history is primarily evacuated, or seems to be in the film, and yet it's in constant dialogue with French sources, French discussion about French Jews. And one of them, I think, really comes to the fore in the beginning of the film when she, well, first, they're taking off, right? So you have your scene of the neurotic Jew questing for their origins. They've, been invited, and she is interested in her own heritage more than the heritage of her husband's. And she gets there, they go through the airport, and you have this sort of desolate scene. There's nobody there. It's almost as if, I don't know if any of you have taken trips to Eastern Europe when the wall was still up, but if you went to East Berlin, it was kind of dark and empty in a lot of the places. It felt very strange in the 80s when I was there. I had that feeling as they were going through the airport, and when they step out, it's her idealized version of Poland. It's Disney. It is wonderful. It's colorful. It's lush. And you'll see that there's a big division in the first half of the film to the second half of the film in terms of color and in terms of the ways that she represents Poland as Anna's eyes change in this, sort of identity quest. But she gets there and they're outside, and she says, I feel all of these sensations rising up within me. And of course he's like, well, how could you have these sensations? You've never been here. And they're in direct dialogue with what is called the imaginary Jew, which is this sort of fashion in France that Alan Finkielkraut described of Jews who have no ties to their origins. And it's not only the Holocaust, they had a long time been assimilated, who are now sort of questing for their origins. Another sort of beautiful scene, if you're interested in languages play a very important role in the film. When they go to buy her shoes in the Polish store, she loves Poland. She's all excited about being Polish. And is sort of taking on this identity. And he says, les chaussures de ma femme, no, the shoes of my wife is pourri, kaput, which is gorgeous. I mean, I would kill any of my French students because the shoes is plural, is singular. Pourri means, comment est-ce qu'on dit pourri? Rotten. And is rotten. And then he says kaput. So you've got the French, the English, etc. What you won't see much of is Yiddish. Which this population is precisely that population that the traditional French population that no longer exists would sort of look their nose down on. Speaking Yiddish wasn't something that was considered bienséant, done in polite society. It was a class distinction. But there's all kinds of play with language in the film that I think you'll find very interesting. I think you'll also find this Poland. We might want to talk about interesting because this film's produced after the law is put into place and then sort of retracted by Poland about any discussion of complicity in the Holocaust. And it's pretty audacious of her to have the mother saying what you would hear, or what I have heard, about Poland, particularly a couple of quotes. These are actually quotes from contemporary news that she pulls out, that they're genetically predisposed to, genetically anti-Semitic. Now, that wasn't actually, it's a very controversial statement that wasn't actually said about the Polish recently, but it was said about other communities that are anti-Semitic. So she definitely was playing with that illusion. But the mother's vision of Poland, which is of course dangerous, something that her mother wanted to get away, but her mother never told her. We have the whole myth of silence being played out in that second generation. And it's the third generation, the cliche, they finally talk to the grandchildren. Well, this grandmother can't talk. And the absences of this film, the absence of the house, the grandmother, the history, the sort of reaching to build back to some past, is very poignant. But Anna's idealized version of Poland, takes a turn over time. And when we get to the end, we've got this wonderful vision of France that completely obfuscates the fact that, of course, France sent 75,000 Jews to deportation, participated certainly in the removal of civil rights for Jews in France. Some other perhaps things you might want to that you might notice is anti-Semitism isn't discussed as something that has to do with France. And this film is produced at a time when we've just had major departures and exodus from France yearly, going up probably through 2016, 2017. But her mother says anti-Semites are in Poland, everything about the Holocaust in Poland. And when they get there, she's excited, but when she gets into that cab to get the rental car, she's already fantasizing that the taxi driver may be preparing this commemoration is really just another step in the final solution. They want to get all the rest of the Jews together and get rid of them. So I thought there were a number of moments that were very interesting in terms of the tensions of what it means to be a European Jew and deal with the sort of memory tourism that is now going on. I thought they did a sort of gorgeous but cheeky version of, the Disney Krakow and the sort of Holocaust industry, which is regularly criticized. But I did think it was interesting in terms of current events that they did point out the graffiti of the Jewish stars that's been explained away as simply team rivalry between soccer players. This was a major issue at the time in Europe. I don't know to what degree it made it here. Ditto for the soundtrack. If you're an assimilated Jew, what does Judaism mean? Because like France is evacuated, religion's evacuated. There's almost no religion here. There's Hava Nagila, which opens and closes it. There's the circumcision, which opens and closes it in pretty interesting ways. And there's the marriage. And the bris is even described by the grandmother, by the mother, as barbaric. So I just wanted to kind of sensitize you to some of the things that I found most striking about the film, and the rest I think we will probably come out in questions. So I'll just open it up. You can turn your mics on and make comments, observations, questions, mother-daughter relations.
I had one observation that you might want to comment, and that is the use of photography, because the opening and the end of it had photographs of various generations, and they also had photos that they showed. Remember, she showed somebody the photo. Maybe you can comment on that.
Oh, yes, I can. That's the dangers of not actually writing a presentation, especially when your book is on photography. I love the photography. And basically, I told you this is autobiographical. Those photos that you're seeing in the opening and closing, those are family photographs that she's using. And yeah, so you see her marriage, you see a couple of other scenes of her family, and it shifts from the family photographs to that invitation, which is mounted onto the building. And that sort of past and present, the photo, which is a trace, that's all they have is fragments, trace, documents, will play out, and then you'll see it's seen later on when she's in front of the building. And on the heels of Muna the other night, I thought that was interesting because she's playing through the aunt's old photos. She's looking at past and present. And we have that going on with that building scene that is in her grandmother's records, which also included the livre de famille, the family booklet. We have in Europe, you have a family ID booklet, which was how the mother eventually found the address to come and take her daughter. And that's an extraordinary scene with her mother, because remember early in the film, she said to her mother, like, what do you know about Poland? You've never put your foot there. But when we get to the house and the house isn't there, and she is in so much pain for this history she doesn't have, and for the pain that she sensed in her mother, the mother resurrects a story that never existed. So this is about imaginary Jews, right? And she tells the story of, the chickens would have been here. I don't remember exactly what it was. but yes, I think the photo work was beautiful. I thought the shots of Poland were also beautiful. We don't get the gray until much later. Um, and it's really a visual bonanza, a bit too much at the beginning, and you see it like the figurines, um, uh, the sort of tchotchke stuff, right? And stars being sold and medals being sold, and the sort of cheapness of memory really contrasts with what happens once the ghosts of the past start to emerge. And, in terms of this absence of past, you see her looking out the window in that early scene. And you have this absence, the grandmother's absence, the narration is absent, but it's only when she sneaks to that town that she thinks is her grandmother's. And she says, where are the Jews? And she says, there aren't any, that Anna really loses it. She breaks down. So that absence of Jews, which is going to be poignant when we get to the cemetery scenes, is, she really becomes emotional then, and it will continue. She's a hysterical character, from beginning to end, the borscht scene, the bathroom scenes. Yeah, that jarred the crowd in the 16th, I have to say, a little bit. So thank you, Lynn. I don't know if you want to hear more about the use of photographs, but of course, that's the salvation, the salvage operation, right? And that's all that this generation has. It constantly plays with that question, though, the myth of silence versus what was salvaged. And there's this guy who wrote this 700-page book on it all being a myth. There was no silence. Everybody talked about it, and she's arguing with this. She's basically, we agree that there was scholarly stuff, salvage stuff that went on, but in terms of family dynamics, everyone I interview still, we've seen come up with the same story. Couldn't talk to my parents, not everyone, but couldn't talk to my parents about it. So she really bangs back at Asuvi on that. I think consciously. So yeah.
I wanted to talk about the supposed anti-Semitism, that the family, one way or another, all believes there was anti-Semitism, and that they will encounter anti-Semitism when they go to Poland. And in fact, they don't. You could point to a few cases where it could be interpreted that way. And I think about the perspective of the Poles who are left there in places where the Holocaust took place, where large Jewish populations left the area, and how they think about the Jews. And there was sort of this jibing about the fact that it's become a business, but the tourists come. How should the Poles actually deal with the people who come and expect certain things, sometimes in a very nasty way, as you could see in the film, but at the same time to respect, the people who live there to a certain extent. It just, I know the film focused on the French perspective, the French Jewish perspective, but it certainly, you need to look at the other side to it as well.
I agree 100%. And I thought it was really a displacement of anti-Semitism. There wasn't much, it dealt with the French, but the mother's perspective is all Poles are anti-Semites. And when she goes to the hotel, she changes her name, Madame de la Croix, right? But also the husband, he's insulted when they give him a brochure for klezmer music, right? So this being identified as a Jew is so exceptional to this couple that they have a problem. But you're quite right. And
Gail, you might want to explain what the name de la Croix means.
Oh, sorry. Oh, okay. Good point. So first of all, it completely evacuates anything Jewish because it's got a de in it. And in order to have a de, it puts you in noble extraction, number one. But de la croix means of the cross. So sorry, good point. Is of the cross. And but you're correct. And in fact, the family who organizes both the real commemoration and the fictional commemoration are a Gentile family that has done this work in Sgiert. And there are, there are other families, not just this filmmaker, who have written about that commemoration, which was a bit less, this was a pretty sparse group that she represents. She wants to show it's not a big deal. There's not a lot of people coming, but the real one was bigger. Yeah. Sorry, Alice. Yeah. Alice, are you on mute?
Hear you.
We can't hear you, sweetie, but can you write it in the chat and I'll be happy to answer? I think she's signing back on, so I could maybe take it out. I don't know if I answered it fully enough, but certainly they're showing that, yes, they're selling this heritage on the one hand, but there are people who are involved. And by the way, when she made the film, because I saw one of her interviews, the people from the original, because she made the film years later, that she had met on that first trip came and watched some of the shoots and participated in them. So Alice, you're on mute now, but maybe we can hear you. No, the mic's off. I'm sorry. But I can definitely take whatever question, and if you know how to do it in the chat.
Did you unmute yourself, Alice?
She did.
So click on the mute button down on the bottom left and look at the settings that are available. You could go to built-in microphone, perhaps, or same as system, or built-in output.
Jack, did you have a comment? I saw a hand, but yeah, I'm not sure.
I have a number of comments, but
400 comments, yeah.
well, I go with one. That was when I first saw it, that was sort of taken by the scenes of Kazimierz. It's a section of Krakow that historically was a Jewish section. I have to go back a few hundred years, not by the 20th century, but although by 20th century it was poor Jews who lived there. And then more recently it's become gentrified. And so people have been buying homes there and really hovels and renovating them. And they were quite expensive by Polish standards. It's also become a major tourist area because they've opened up restaurants on Jewish themes. So they have klezmer bands playing every night. They have some, fake Jewish food. And but it's sort of, if you go to Auschwitz, this is where you come to unwind. In Kazimierz. And a friend of mine opened up a hotel that he says is 3.5 stars. And the half stars is because there's a mikveh in it. So that's the
kosher restaurants play
they're not kosher.
That's Jews who come because they're the only places they can eat while they're in Poland.
No, but they're not kosher. They're Jewish style.
Sure, there are.
There is one. There's one. Sorry.
There's there's a wonderful kosher moment, if you remember, when he orders sausage and she says, "You ordered sausage," and he says, "We don't keep kosher." And of course, she's just come downstairs complaining because her mother's not supposed to touch any of the food because she can't cook. That gets given to her son, and she wants protein. She wants to put ham in the baby's food. So that may not be an obvious allusion to you guys, but for us, it's an obvious allusion because in 2011, when the halal kashrut debates in school lunches was going on, they would say, well, the children have to have ham because they have to have protein and because it's French. So that, and then of course, he's just ordered sausage, and she's like, "You ordered sausage?" He goes, "We're not kosher." And she said, "Well, these people were persecuted for being Jewish. We can at least be kosher right now." So I just thought that there were pretty fabulous moments and then some quirky moments. Like one I wanted to ask Mo about. So, there are lots of allusions, right, in the film, both literary, French literary, and even to, I would say, French Jewish comedic narratives more than, but there's these allusions to films that we were talking about this morning. So in one scene alone, there's like Le Grand Bleu, Cousin, Cousine. What else was in that one scene? Which was the other?
Rabbi Jacob.
Rabbi Jacob, when he says, I married the
Yeah.
Rabbi Jacob.
Yes.
But you know, Le Grand Bleu is a journey film, right? You have Cousin Cousine. Wasn't sure about that. I was like, well, maybe for the family illusions.
So Singing in the Rain.
Singing in the Rain was a visual illusion, which was beautiful, only done to
Right.
Chopin. And then there was Titanic. And then there was one more, A Dead Poets Society. So, you know, she's sort of played with many of these films, but I thought they were sort of sending you another direction from the films that it's really in dialogue with. One of them is gotta be Ils sont partout, the Jews, which came out, which is also the sort of neurotic Jew searching for his origins, really worth seeing. And that goes through the greatest hits of Jewish history, whereas the French Jewish history and Jewish history, whereas this, there isn't a French Jewish history. It's really, to a large extent, explicitly evacuated and yet always present.
But so is Polish Jewish history. It's evacuated completely. Is
Oh,
that
yeah.
Poles really don't exist?
It's
They're,
decor.
they're not in the background. They're not there. You know, it's
They're
it's
not
really-
there, or they're there in caricature, right? So the girl in the shop who wants to go to Paris and, you know, gives you the shape of the Eiffel Tower.
but
And you,
she's not a Jew.
well, I know. Well, there's no Jews. That's obvious. When she gets to the town and she says there are no more, and then you see the empty houses, that absence. She did a good job conveying, I think, the absence of Jews. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
So when they take the taxi cab to go pick up the rental car,
Mhm.
she's in the back getting very worried about where they're being taken. And the taxi driver, when they get to their destination, you don't know that at the moment. You don't know that they're there. He turns around and he starts yelling, "Jihadi, jihadi."
No,
What is
no,
that
no.
about?
No,
It's
he's
the
telling
name of
them
the
they're
town.
there.
It was the name of the town he was
He's telling
saying.
them they're there. They've
Yeah.
arrived.
The name of the town is Jihadi?
No,
Yeah.
no. It's was
Jihadi.
Zigej? Was that the town that it went
Yes,
to, or
it's a
something?
town. He's letting them know they've arrived at the rental car pickup, and I don't
How do you
remember
say
exactly.
that in Polish?
I don't remember
I
exactly
don't
what he
remember.
said. Zgielts is the name of the town. That's not it. He was letting them, because they haven't driven there. He
No.
was letting them know that they'd arrived at the rental car place, which is this out, like when you get those tours, you often get these
Yeah.
out of the way weirdo places, and then you get the two video game playing guys who, you know,
Ping and Pong.
Ping and Pong, who speaks Chinese, and is doing shots of, you know, vodka with them. So
Before they get on the road.
yeah, it was really, you know, Ping and Pong were Ching and Chong, obviously. Isn't that the right names? Is that right?
Cheech and Chong.
Cheech and Chong or whatever. Sorry,
Yeah.
I was before my time, but nonetheless, it really has some quite bawdy moments, and yet I thought it was really poignant. And
I'm going to go back and listen to what he said and what it sounded like, because it's possible that that also was a play on the language. That Polish, you've arrived, but it sounds like jihadi.
well, the idea of the neurotic, you know, Jew with complex who sees anti-Semitism everywhere, you know, the mom, the husband doing that, that's what's going on. She hasn't been like that. She, up till then, she loves it. She goes outside and Chopin plays in her mind, right? But when she's on the way there, she's going back into those ghosts. So she's anxious. And that uncanny moment where, you know, maybe this is really a plot, you know, yeah, it's meant to be jarring, but no, I think he just let them know they were there, because he says it again, like, you know, this is the stop.
You had to
But
tell
no.
him 3 times.
No, but I definitely didn't hear jihadi. Yeah.
One of the there's a number of criticisms I have of the film, even though I enjoyed it. I
Yeah.
enjoyed it more this time than the first time, but still a number of intellectual criticisms more than anything else. It's a complete absence of Jews, complete absence, and it's a very false image. I mean, Jews are increasingly present in Poland, increasingly visible. If you were traveling through that part of Poland, you would see Hasidim traveling there, because they're making pilgrimages to the sites of famous rebbes, you know, to put the kvitlach. And you saw in the Ramu synagogue in the cemetery, you saw the tombstones, you saw the kvitlach that they put. The very abbreviated showing of the Kazimierz section. Just to point out that if anyone really enjoys that section, it's Polish Jews. As commercial as it may seem to us, for Polish Jews, it's an old country. It's like represents what was lost, and they go for the annual Jewish cultural festival. So it's a complex relationship between these representations of the past, that are both commercial and Disneyland-esque, but at the same time are absorbed by the native population as authentic. And so it's the film doesn't go into it, but it's just something to think, not to dispense with it entirely as just Fantasyland.
No, the absence of religion, which I talked about where at the beginning, the absence of religion, the absence of Judaism, it's really just in a couple of key words, key moments, and it's meant to be.
Oh, for sure.
It's meant to be that
No,
way.
no synagogues are shown in the film.
No,
No,
synagogue, only one rabbi.
No ruins of synagogues, which is strange.
And only one rabbi, and the only thing that it relates to, it's not to any other kind of prayer, but it relates to that commemoration prayer with the naming of the concentration camps.
Mm-hmm.
That is the crux of her Judaism: marriage, circumcision, the Shoah. And so it plays on that. But again, it is very, very atypical for France or French Jews now. So that was the big surprise there for me, that homage to France and to wanting to be French.
Can we find out can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, loud and clear.
Yay! So I missed 5 minutes. Okay. I didn't find it unusual. I was looking at it in terms of what all the emphasis seems to be at the Holocaust Museum in Washington. I mean, of the people who are there, and the books. Like, I was thinking of Aaron Einhorn's book. Do you know that book? Pages.
No, what are you saying wasn't unusual? I'm not
Well,
sure
what isn't unusual is this third generation going back to Poland.
No, yeah.
To look for their past, but really the whole text is, this is my personal opinion about it, or what troubles me about it, is that it's about them and not about their past.
Right. That's not unusual. That's not the part that was unusual. The part that I was saying was unusual. And yes, it's standard for third generation. What's unusual is at this time, when French Jews have become quite religious and practicing, to have a work that is an explicit homage to assimilation at the end. There's no problem with that lack of religiousness. It's okay to bury the foreskin in a potted plant in Paris. These kinds of that's unusual. Sorry.
But there is this whole, I mean, in Budapest, where I spend more of my time, right? I mean, I don't go to Poland, but I go to Budapest. The whole Jewish district has all of a sudden, I mean, in the last 10 years, has become not a tourist attraction. It's a place where the Israelis come, and they're buying apartments in the Jewish quarter, I think in order to get EU visas. I don't really know what the deal is, but there's this kind of, there is this, and it's not that Israelis come to Budapest really interested in finding out about their Hungarian past. But
there's also investors in the shopping malls, right?
Oh yeah, no, it's whole apartment buildings where almost all the apartments are empty, and they've been purchased. It's like establishing an alternative option. I don't really know, but that seems to be what is going on in Poland too. And when Rachel Rothstein was writing her dissertation on Poland, on the post-68 Jewish community in Poland, she was walking around somewhere in Oswiecim probably, and there was a busload of American kids who came by, and they were all pointing at her when they were describing, you know, the terrible Poles.
Yeah. Well, if you want to read a great piece that deals with Holocaust tourism, you have your colleague's Bloody Memories there. Jack's written extensively on this in the 80s.
Right.
Yeah, no, I thought it was a very interesting take, and a very French take, because there, you know, there's a degree of condescension in the gaze for sure when they come in. And in France, this has, you know, obviously been in the air in terms of public debates about the graffiti, about kashrut. These are all in, you know, in the public sphere, you know, sort of right now. I'm curious about other questions or things that you thought were.
I have one question. Why is she so uptight? It has nothing to do with the Holocaust, right?
No, yeah,
I
well,
don't think it does. You know, all this, like, you know, she's very, before she leaves, right? She's
a combination of she is the female or feminine rendering of the neurotic male Jew that we often see, like Woody Allen, or even in Namesake. Alex, did you read that? Namesake by Goldberg. I don't know if you're in the class. You know, they're modeled on Solal, which is Albert Cohen's, you know, comical, neurotic, nutso, hysterical Jewish protagonist going to do heroic acts or transmit their history or find their origins. So yeah, he's over the top and, you know, pretty annoying and hysterical at moments, and never sort of comes out of overdrive. It's true. But I think she was meant to do that. And I know that she wanted them to look at, you know, comedy. And speaking of, you know, comedy or humor, a pretty anti-Semitic review that I saw, or as anti-Semitic as covert anti-Semitism goes, described this as, you know, it was a problem to put the Holocaust together with Jewish humor. And sort of we were playing with, you know, what makes this Jewish humor other than it deals with Jewish themes, etc. And I do think her character, to some degree, is one aspect of it. Otherwise, it's very French humor. It's like Les Visiteurs. It's like Bienvenue chez les Ch'tis. Ch'tis, again, Ch'ti.
So can you, maybe, if that's the case, then you please answer this question.
Okay.
Why does it show, first of all, it doesn't show the couple naked in bed together, but it does show her wiping her tush.
Yeah.
And I was a little taken aback by that.
I mentioned that way at the beginning. I mentioned the sort of shock that the audience in the 16th had with sort of the scatological. And, you know, she's sort of playing with that limit. She's also representing a very particular class, but she's playing with that sort of uncouth. And she's an aspect.
Their interpretation of that. I think.
Go ahead. Let me add to it. Let me answer to complicate your answer. The phone falls into the toilet.
That's right. The phone.
I know that was well,
and then her husband is astounded that she actually admitted that she pooped. So now go ahead and answer.
He's not astounded. He's absolutely teasing her and making fun of her, and that's their relationship. I'm sorry, Mo.
Well, the film draws the neurotic compact between the mother and the daughter.
Right.
And and I'm really interested in that because other Jewish filmmakers have emphasized that as well, that mother-daughter relationship is crippling at the beginning of the film, and then sometimes there's a resolution and sometimes there isn't.
If you read this in Lacanian terms, Mo, it would be exactly that. L'hystérique fait travailler le maître.
Yeah.
You know? So I got it. Let me translate that. Hang on. So, yeah, in one psychoanalyst vision of familial and linguistic relations, the hysteric makes the masterwork, the questioning one. So the mother's silent, right? She's not giving her anything. The hysteric forces that dialogue. But yeah, it's a great relationship, and you see it from the very beginning when they arrive. They are such a typically French set of parents that I was cracking up at the way that the humorous way they did the family. I sort of really enjoyed, but that mother-daughter relationship is impressive, and the fact that she didn't really in the real story. And the mother didn't show up out of the blue. That's fiction. But when they went on there, I'm sorry.
The mother's coming sets up this moment where the two of them reconcile and work something out in relationship to the grandmother.
Mhm.
The sight of the empty house.
Which really did not happen outside of the film.
And what was so interesting was when they were reconciled in this empty field that was supposed to be where the house was, that even before that happened, talking about transmission, the mother asked for directions and then she spoke Polish, and the daughter didn't know anything about her even being able to speak Polish, and she had never told her daughter about it. So that whole interaction and then ending up in the field and reconciling. So there was transmission that was surprising to the daughter, and then a silent transmission in the field.
Most of it is transmitted through silence. This way, our heritage was only primarily silence, bits and pieces, fragments, photographs, what you would learn in school.
Right, yeah.
So yeah.
Very interesting interactions.
I was pleased that the movie did the empty field rather than what the more cliche version is.
It wouldn't have allowed her to resurrect it. She's playing with Finkelkraut, the imaginary Jew. It's everywhere. And right there, she's having the mother resurrect an imaginary grandmother's house with an imaginary grandmother's chicken coop. Yeah. Alex, you were going to ask a question, weren't you?
Yeah, I was. I actually wanted to go to something a little bit more serious that we kind of you touched on a little bit at the beginning, but how much of this do you think is in response to the lobbying for the Polish Holocaust law? Because they were obviously, the law came into effect in 2018 when this movie was released, but there was lobbying going back to, I think, 1998 for that law. And I think it's like Law and Justice Party, I think, got elected in like 2006, if I'm right. But I was curious how much of that was in relation.
A viewer who is aware of that or in France, it's going to be in your face, the degree to which her mother is so blatant in what she's saying, because we know the tension that has been mounting, not from 18 and 19, but from 10 at least on, right? You can really feel the pressure. So I think it is, on the one hand, there, a response, a sort of thumbing your nose at it, absolutely. And on the other hand, because of what she did do, because of the sort of journey that they did take, actually, the people that they met, their actual experience, I think that was toned down to some degree. It could have been, it's not as negative as it could have been. I think there was a fair amount of recognition for the memory work that's going on, even if it's not coming from the top down, right? Did that kind
I felt
that. Go ahead. Alex?
Oh, I was just saying, I felt that the commentary on that was pretty indirect, and I just had known about the correlation in the years. That's why I was curious about it, because it doesn't feel like it's something that's addressed. It definitely feels like it's something they kind of skate around, like it's obviously part of the tone and of the moment. And I imagine that in the screening that was probably on the topic, but it isn't directly addressed. So I was just curious about that.
They say the mother's, obsessed, and she's kind of nuts with her paranoia, right? They'll actually say it that way. And the mother, as I said, I don't know if you caught it, but when she says they're genetically anti-Semitic, she's playing on two things. Like, yes, I am going to say these things about Poland, and not only am I going to say them about Poland, but I'm going to say them about Poland, saying what we're all saying about the Muslim population. Not we're all saying, but what people are being criticized for saying. So that sort of conflation of new anti-Semitism with the old is very subtle, but it's there.
It's also a quote from Ishak Shamir, that a quasi quote in which he said, the Poles imbibe anti-Semitism in their mother's milk.
Right. But more recently, there was a French commentator we know who took that and said that Muslims are genetically anti-Semitic. And that was a huge scandal in France right before the film was made.
I think that the denial of some Poles of what had happened in Poland was also shown in the first town that she went to, where she thought she was going to find her grandmother's origins the first time, when the woman says, no Jews, no Jews here, never were any Jews here.
I'm not sure that that's denial as much as, you know, the actuality, you know, that she's trying to get across.
Absolutely.
Wait. There are lots of instances, aren't there, of towns in Poland who said, no, there were never any Jews here. And then you find that the cemeteries have been bulldozed, or that
Yeah,
but not today.
but not in the
Not
film.
today.
Yeah, but not.
today.
There's also
There's been a
there's
lot
also-
of memory work in Poland, and it would be unusual today for someone to say that at one time you might have had that, but things have changed quite a bit in Poland.
Glad to hear it.
There's also actually that whole klezmer music thing that's, you know, that we think of as kitsch and as about tourism. There actually are Poles who have become so immersed in it. Like this Einhorn book that I mentioned, she rooms, the American journalist rooms on her Fulbright with a Pole who has decided to convert to Judaism.
Yeah, there are many.
So there is that happening in Poland.
There are lots of non-Jews who are engaging in both the business of it and the research of it.
Well, once they get inside the business, and then it becomes their life.
There was a really interesting New York Times piece in the magazine, maybe 10, 15 years ago.
A little more, I think, but a little more than that.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. It was by Pico Iyer. What's his name? And it was, but he talked about Kajime. She was talking about it as a Disneyland and so on. Pico Iyer. Pico, what's his name?
Iyer.
Yeah.
However you say it.
Yeah.
Well, I'm out of date, because my thinking is like based on National Geographic on the last Jews in Poland, which is probably,
Yes,
I don't
you're
know,
very
40
out of
years
date.
old, 50 years
You're
old.
very out of date,
Yeah.
boy.
Yeah.
I have to go to Krakow. That's where my paternal side is from.
It's a nice town.
So did you find it jarring, or how did you respond to this odd mix?
Who?
You, all of you.
Oh.
I'm curious what the responses were. You know, I don't.
I thought there were some. I liked the film in general. I thought that it was intellectually weaker than I would like it to have been. I thought there was moments that could have been absolutely profound, and it didn't drive it home sufficiently. It wasn't quite complex enough. I would have liked to have seen it better, a little bit better written, and really thought through a little bit more. But you know, it was entertaining. I thought it was a good Saturday night film. Wasn't that the only jarring thing was wiping her tush, which I thought was a little bit much, you know. But you know,
It's what we do every day.
I didn't think they had a good time, and I think that the couple needed more than 3 days. I mean, just as a way of talking about Jack's talking about the writing, he needed more than 3 days to find out something about Poland.
right.
Maybe ironic.
To find something out about their families or whatever they were looking for, they weren't going to find it in a 3-day trip.
They try to say that he's going because he wants to get away for the kids, and it's
Right.
called honeymoon, lune de miel. So it's supposed to be the moment that they're alone. But the fact of the matter is he doesn't just want to get her alone without the kid. He is going. He doesn't just go for her. I don't have that sense when he's walking through and looking at his grandfather's village, nor in the one scene where we have the rabbi and you know, when they're doing their sort of their tourism and looking at the wall. I don't have that sense. But yes, it's an ironic honeymoon. Because no, Jack, you never see them take their clothes off, and no, you never see anything more. There's no real honeymoon. It's a trip to their ghosts.
Well,
Yeah,
Actually-
I thought that the scene with the field, for example, could have been more powerful than it was presented. That was a good idea. With the field, with the house, the absent house. I thought it was a good idea. I thought it didn't quite have the power I would like it to have had.
I actually wanted to get clarification on something that I think a couple people have brought up, because they mentioned in the film, and this is definitely gonna be my age speaking, but they referred to it in the film as being like Disneyland for the Holocaust. The husband says that. And I guess somebody mentioned that I guess there was a New York Times article that uses that same phrase. Is that a common phrase that has been used? Is there like a more history to that phrase specifically?
It is a common phrase that's used.
It's common phrase.
Well,
Yeah.
you don't get a sense of it, but there is a period, there is a moment when I don't know, thousands and thousands of people come for this klezmer festival.
It's a Jewish cultural festival in Krakow every summer, and it is the biggest Jewish cultural festival in Europe. It's the most successful one, not the only one, but it's become extremely well known.
Yeah, it's the biggest. Within France, the Holocaust industry, l'industrie de la Shoah, they call it, Holocaust industry, it's a point of contention. There are those who use it as a banner to argue against calling attention to ethnicity, calling attention to one particular group's history. So, her playing that card is at once playing on French conceptions of what's going on in Poland and that kind of memory work, but also engaging with that debate. And she goes beyond that. Like, you get there and it's a Disney and it's tourists, but they do go beyond it. So it shows that those trips have some depths of some kind, or at least reach certain nerves.
This is a minor detail, but I really thought that the subtitles were missing in a lot of places. I didn't know if it was a technical issue on my transmission or not.
It was probably a budgetary issue on the Polish, and on it wasn't just Polish that was eliminated. I have to admit, I usually pay attention to this just because we do them, so I'm always really careful. But on this one, I was just listening because it's French. But I did notice that they didn't have some of the Polish in. I don't know what else they didn't have in. I'd have to go back.
I think they only translated the French dialogue, because I noticed that as well. And I actually rewinded at a couple points to make sure. And I believe they only translated the French dialogue and the English subtitles. I don't think anything else was translated.
It was a time thing. They didn't even translate Kaput. Beverly, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to mention a book that I think is a very good complement to this picture. So I recently read this book called A Woman of No Importance by Sonia Purnell. And this woman was an American spy in World War II who actually worked for the English initially and worked in France. And she was the person she seemed to be the person who started the underground in France, who helped save Jews. And you see an enormous amount of the terrible things that happen, as well as the people who were helping. It is an amazing, fascinating book. The woman was absolutely amazing. And while I'm not really a student of history, I read this because the woman's name was Virginia Hall. And I believe I met her while I was in graduate school.
Oh, wow. So because the film evacuates France's engagement in the Shoah, and I say engagement knowingly, I didn't go too far into that. And there were an enormous number of progressively resistors, and certainly an enormous number of women who were either recognized or not recognized. The women who came over who were working for the Brits were certainly not the only women resistors on the ground in France and from a fairly early start. They started dropping them in much later when they were certain that the resistors on the ground were actually resistors on the ground. So that comes in a little bit later, and there's a lot of interest in them. And I think a film about some of them that were from the same group who were interrogated and then burned at Natzweiler, which was the concentration camp on French territory in Alsace. But I evacuated most of that, and so does the film, which is not, obviously a pleasant story, but it is that very present absence in the film. A French public has that narrative down, or at least the French public that's going to see it. They know about Vichy. They know by now that France had, over 50 just in the South, concentration camps in the South. They know that French Jews were deported. They know that it's not only in Poland that the Holocaust happened. So, but watching this, it's a Saturday night film, right? And it's sort of a comedy. The French aren't going to necessarily want to see that. One of the things that's nice about this film, as much as it's not a chef-d'oeuvre, is that you don't get a lot of focus on the Polish immigrants who came over in literature and film. Even though they were an extremely active and culturally active group, this the target here is not on Jews from the 16th or Jews from the South, or those who came over in the decolonization period who would be Sephardim. This is a population that was sort of looked down on, and I think she's playing with that with all her toilet stuff too. Yes, there's familial and Freudian stuff, and Freudian stuff going on there, but she's not. But the class element there, I think, is important.
France doesn't appear in the film.
France, you mean?
France does. No French people except the absolute family, and the inside the one room of their apartment. Because France is only what France is it's not Poland.
According to this, you're right. I talked about this evacuation, and for this family, Jewish heritage is transmitted through the family and stays in the family. It's not the outside thing. This, that's why I said you have this surprising homage to assimilation at the end. But absolutely not. France is evacuated to a large extent, and yes, and yet very present. She's got this play of things she takes out, and yes, and yet the film is constantly in dialogue with them. So what France did to the Polish Jews, remember, most of them did not receive citizenship. Polish Jews who immigrated to France who received citizenship were primarily those who immigrated in the 19th century. Those who came in the 20th century, in the 2 decades before the war, mostly did not get citizenship, and those who did were actually, it was revoked, and revoked by the Third Republic, not by Vichy, in 1939 first, before it was revoked in 1940. So that's a tough history to deal with. And this is a film that's an homage to France in honor of the sort of grandmother's memory. So they're sort of playing that out, and yet it's there. Jack, is that your hand, or is it?
It's my hand, yeah.
I couldn't, okay. I'm blind.
It's my hand. And at the risk of sort of repeating something that Mo was explaining and I may not have caught, but it seems to me that the scatological preoccupation, or not preoccupation, but certainly the moments of it are about discipline, disciplining the body, and that what this family represents is a de-Judaized European Jewry. They become civilized, and the sign of it is how they handle their balance, and that she basically doesn't defecate. This is his take on her, is that there's no, you would never know that she even shits.
Okay,
and
so that's
I just finish the thought, because the mother's evacuation, and perhaps we shouldn't be using the word evacuation all the time, but it's her mother's or her grandmother's evacuation of her Polishness, her Jewishness, or what's left. It's like she's evacuated everything visceral within her.
Okay, in part, some of that, assuming all that's fine, in part, some of that is playing on French pudeur. So you have this really kind of scrappy family that's saying just about anything. She curses every chance she gets. In the hotel, lobby, she's screaming putain. And it's not that she doesn't go, it's that she doesn't want her husband to go, and she puts on the faucet so that he doesn't hear her, like the Japanese it's the Japanese, right, who put on the music when you go to the toilet, right? So this sort of, extreme modesty when, juxtaposed with what is pretty, bawdy stuff. I think there is sometimes though, this comedic, almost even carnivalesque aspect allows other things to pass. So you could have a very hard discussion about the trauma of food. And in some of the interviews that I did, where people were talking about the heritage of their food, like this isn't my borscht, this isn't my soup. These can all become very serious, or they can be brought to your attention in different ways and have different effects. But yeah, it's pretty jarring. Those scenes, we're not used to them. And no, it's so wildly assimilated. And that's why I say certainly not representative, but representative of a certain generation. Don't forget that the Polish Jews really aped the Alsatian Jews, who had been fairly well integrated. They wanted to be more like them. They ended up more being in the proletariat and the working class, and were the first to go, right? The Eastern European Jews were the first to be deported. The French public, not all the public, but the public's going to go to this film, is going to see it. Notice that in the French titles, Lune de Miel, there's no Poland. Notice that in the working title, Même pas froid, not even cold, there's no Poland. It's in the English title where it's a honeymoon in Poland also. So there's a box office issue, of who is going to want to go to a film in a country at times where people reject constant discussion of the Holocaust or will blame Jews for only talking about the Holocaust or themselves. And I'm speaking, generally, but you have to deal with that when we look at the receipts for something, or the lines for something like La Rafle, the roundup. I don't know if any of you have seen that. I would have expected an interest in history, is that you would get large crowds. But in general, when we went, it was empty. So there's, a big difference between the national narrative and the national interest, and some community interest, and certainly how this film passes, because it's panned pretty wildly and with some pretty anti-Semitic terms in some places, and in other places, much less so. I was surprised to see the Figaro was relatively positive.
Do we know why she cared about knowing about her past? Because one of the effects of not talking about it for a generation is that there is a whole generation it doesn't, a lot of people it's not part of their life. It's not something, it's just something they learn about in Hebrew school.
There's a sort of decade by decade development of how the French Jewish, and which French Jewish populations, but how French Jewish populations will deal with that past, with that history. And here she's trying to reconnect with the history before the Shoah that she feels is missing to her. But she fits in at a time when, as I said, the French Jewish population numerous times has become more and more religious and more interested in their past and their heritage. That will, in the war, post-war, you got, the 40s where everybody wants to just be French. We want to forget that happened kind of quickly, but still the narratives are coming. They're being collected. They're being salvaged. But it's still the narrative of the resistance. The 60s, and her parents were like 68ers, right? They were hippies. They were atheists. Okay. This generation, 60s, 70s, they're heading into multiculturalism, but that's the generation of French Jews within the Jewish community who were starting to become interested. Paxton's about to write his book. It's not that things aren't being produced. They are. By the time you get to the 80s, you got multiculturalism, you got an explosion of Holocaust narratives that are trying to make sense of their past. in the 21st century, if you were an atheist in 68, if you believed in multiculturalism in the 80s, when you get to the 21st century and you have no choice but to acknowledge that you are a Jew because your kids can't go to school, it's a little hard not to pay attention. But she falls into, since I do know some of her story, she was interested. She was interested in her past. She was interested in this history. And they began to search on the internet before they were contacted by her husband's father's, by the people who wanted to commemorate her husband's grandfather's town. Yes.
But they don't know they don't seem to know anything about the service. I mean, the rabbi, there's nothing.
No, religion is completely evacuated, as it often is in French Jewish cultural production that is meant for a national audience. Alex?
Yeah, I actually, jumping back, like one conversation we were talking about, I mean, the bathroom scenes and that, how like develops in the beginning, I didn't think that was uncommon, especially looking at a lot of like, modern TV shows and modern movies, especially that are targeted at my generation, younger people. That is a pretty like, kind of tongue-in-cheek kind of joke. And I think that really what it highlights is a dynamic that exists in their relationship. And that's kind of what I took out of those scenes, was that even when you're talking about the vodka and she keeps requesting more and he's kind of like giving in a little bit to her, he's definitely teasing her. And he definitely kind of plays on that after the scene when she's saying, I didn't do it, I didn't do anything. And he's like, yeah, of course you didn't. Of course you didn't use the bathroom. And it kind of highlights this relationship where he's kind of willing to go along with a lot of the things she's doing. And that really gets highlighted in the scene where in the car where he kind of hits a breaking point, where he's like, I've been putting up with so much, and this is kind of how you're treating me for this. And so I think a lot of those scenes are really to kind of highlight that dynamic, as well as this kind of independence and paranoia that she has, because that's a part of herself that she can't control. And it's an image she's trying to control. She doesn't want people to think about, her using the bathroom. And she says, oh, I was freshening up, I was getting ready. She's trying to control an image of herself. And she doesn't want, whether it's her mother or her husband, pushing an image that she doesn't want on herself. And I think it really has to do with her self-image and the image she wants to portray of herself and the relationship more than anything else. Or at least that's kind of what I took out of it based on, other films and TV shows that I've seen, around this area. Because a lot of shows comment on similar topics like this, especially when you're talking about younger women, because that's becoming a bigger issue.
It is. And certainly in a sort of lower grade, if you will, comedy, you will see things like that. In fact, we just saw it last night in a series we watched. And so, but it isn't something you see often on the big, or saw often on the big screen, and certainly not in a Holocaust memory film. So I understand, the shock, but I do think it is speaking to that, and it really is in that sense in the tradition of these,
It's also interesting that it's an American style bathroom.
They're mostly American style, but all the new hotels are American style bathrooms. Yeah.
Exactly. So it situates something really different, because the French have their toilet completely separate from the rest of their bathroom in traditional.
Not in the last 10. Yeah, mine are, but not in the last 10. Yeah, they don't. The remodels have one bathroom, no bidet. Maybe the pandemic will change that, but they don't have the toilet paper issue there. But that toilet paper may be the time to. Try not.
Thank you, Gail.
Thanks, Mo. Does anybody have any final questions? If not, thank you very much for.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I didn't even see the chats. Thank you so much, and thank you, Virginia. I don't know if you want to do your advertising thing for the next films that you usually do.
Tomorrow.
Jack, do you want to talk about the movies?
2 movies tomorrow. You have to wind me up. Press the button. So tomorrow afternoon is at 2:30. Is that what it is? 2?
The talkback's at 4:30 with Rachel Gordon.
No, but the film itself is what time?
Oh, I mean, people can watch it anytime, but if they watch it by at least 3:00, they can see it before the talkback at 4:30.
Anyway, it's a terrific film. It's really very good. It isn't what it sounds like.
No.
I do recommend it highly. And then the evening film, and then the evening talkback. is My War Hero Uncle. It's also a terrific film. Not at all what it sounds like, but I think intellectually the best film of the series. That's what I think. But watch it and tell me what you think. It's a short film. You don't think so?
No, but but it's still good and interesting.
It's a good film. Anyway,
For me.
I'm hyping it, but it's a good film. And it's a little bit of a dark horse film. You would never, I don't think I saw it anywhere else. It's just one of these things that I got a hold of and was excited by it. So let's see what you think.
It's actually going to be the Hungarian entry into the Oscars.
Which will?
Those Who Remain.
Those who
Oh,
remain.
that's not tomorrow.
Not my
That's
order.
That's Monday.
Virginia, you're
That's-
on record.
What's that?
Record. You're
Oh,
on
hold on. Stop
Yeah,
recording.